Hi, everyone. This is the fifth episode of the Tammy Joe and Peter Discuss Kinky Movies, or We Discuss Kinky Movies. And we are going to be discussing Exit to Eden. You can see how old this copy is.
Yeah.
And we had some questions that I created for this. I take the blame for this one. I recommended this one.
Yeah.
I also
I
have the book.
yeah, I've got the book. It's I haven't read it in a long time.
Yeah.
This was on my list of books of movies to review. It just that I just remembered how bad it was. Let's just get that out of the way. I remember
Yeah.
how bad it was, and I was really not looking forward to it, but
Yeah.
you
Well,
you got me to bite the bullet. So
well, here are some facts I'll share first. They're
yeah.
just three of them. It was actually really difficult to find information on the internet about this movie. I really struggled to find information about it. So this is what I was able to find, other than your basic lists you can find about movies. Well, it was made in 1994, so it's fairly old. It's almost 30 years old now. It's 28 years old. It was nominated for a couple of Worst Awards, notably for Rosie O'Donnell and Dan Aykroyd for Razzies.
Hmm.
And Rosie O'Donnell won the Razzie.
Yeah.
The whips that you see in the film, like the really high quality ones that they really show you, were made by Jeanette Hartwood, who at that time was like a big name in the the elite kink community for people who could afford the fancy stuff.
Mm.
And the movie was not a financial success nor a critical success.
Yeah.
And what I could see from the reviews that I read about it, it was because I think the same reason we don't like it is my guess. Critics were completely and utterly confused by this movie. They were like, why is this whole buddy cop part of this movie here? Why could they not just make basically a straight movie of this book? And we can maybe talk about why that wouldn't
Yeah.
fly. But I tried to find interviews with Gary Marshall, who is the director, to try to figure out why would you hire Gary Marshall to make a book about basically an erotic fantasy, and what possessed them, and I couldn't find anything.
For those of you who don't know, Gary Marshall was the guy who created Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley.
Yeah.
Um, he also had a big hit with Pretty Woman, which may be some kind of connection there. I have a little more background I want to throw in.
Okay,
This
good.
is from the Folklore Reader,
Okay.
which is a book about by Catherine Ramsland, which is about the erotica Anne Rice, published under some pseudonyms.
Mhm.
So if you're watching this, you've probably at least heard of the Sleeping Beauty trilogy, which was like a big thing in the 90s, and especially once word got out that Anne Rice was writing it under a pseudonym. Exit to Eden, the book, was written in between the second and third books of the Sleeping Beauty trilogy, and she wanted it to be somewhat more realistic in terms of exploring sexuality. Um, there's also some interesting stuff in here about how Rice was friends with John Preston, who was a big name in the gay
Mm,
kink world,
yes.
gay kink erotica world. Although I don't think there was there. I think there was some influence. She talked about that Rice was familiar with his books. He wrote sort of a similar idea of, this secret elite club where of, hardcore submission and dominance, that kind of thing. But I don't think that Preston originated that. I mean, you could go back to the story of O and, all those kinds of things. So it's a perennial myth. So Preston and Rice were friends, and I imagine that might have been some influence later on. When word got out that Rice was writing this stuff, a lot of people wanted her to attend like kink events and things. Apparently, she just didn't want to. I mean, maybe the reality couldn't live up to her fantasy. So, yeah. So Exit Eden was in the galley phase when she actually met Preston, And no, she was not at all happy with how the movie turned out. I think this was I have a suspicion that she sold the film rights, assuming that nobody would ever make a movie of it. Like, it's just, okay, let's just cast a check and don't look back.
Yeah.
And now,
I mean, and
the
it came
book,
out right after Interview with a Vampire was the movie, which they reference within Interview with
oh
the
yeah, the Brad,
Vampire. Yeah,
yeah, there's this whole gag about,
yeah.
there's a, like, one of the many, many extraneous things added is this gag about a look-alike who's supposed to be, some people say he looks like Brad Pitt and some people say he looks like Tom Cruise, but yeah.
Yeah.
But I think this was actually before, wasn't this before Interview with the Vampire came out in film?
Um,
I remember reading something, this was like her first
they
book
must have known that it was happening though.
ever adapted to film. Anyway,
They must have
yeah,
known that it was happening though, because they're very specific about where they make the references, because
yeah,
Narlands is very important to the Interview with the Vampire universe as well. And so
yeah.
it,
And to Anne Rice, I believe
yeah.
she lives there. So now, another big difference is that there is a lot of man-on-man action
Well, let's not
here.
talk about the
Okay.
differences between the two. I thought you
Yes,
might
yes.
have the information about like the background of the movie. Because I remember when it came
Yeah,
out, I had heard things like they kept showing it to test audiences and they kept adding in more of this buddy cop thing, but I
yeah,
could find nothing to confirm that.
yeah. I don't know about, I mean, I think that's entirely plausible because, like, this movie is 2 hour, almost 2 hours long.
Mhm.
There's so many extraneous bits that were even if even a, like, it's not just they added on the whole buddy cop thing, they added on all this other stuff that doesn't really matter, but just that seems to be there just to make it longer and make everything drag out. So that was, I mean, I've heard, you know, reports that, like, they brought back Rosie O'Donnell for to shoot extra scenes, and that's why her weight looks very different in different scenes. Yeah, so this movie is, nothing, there's no behind the scenes shenanigans I wouldn't find plausible. Yeah,
Okay, so let's start with the first question. It's kind of, we both saw this movie when it came out.
yes.
So why did you go see it?
I went because that was, let's see, this was 94. So I was pretty new to the kink world, and I think I was familiar. Yeah, I was familiar with the book at that point. And I just thought, I almost thought it was my duty because it's like we have to represent and stuff like that. And this is what we ended up representing. Even at the time, I remember thinking this was kind of goofy. Um, and yeah, it was just, I've remembered it since. I've felt this is the first time I've seen it since then. Um, and it's even worse than I remember. Wow.
So
Uh,
did you go by yourself or did you go with a group?
I believe I went by myself. How about you?
Okay, so my experience was very different. At that time, I
Yeah.
lived in New York City,
Yeah.
and the Apple Munch had just started a little more than a year before this movie came out. So the Apple Munch, for everyone out there, is a New York City based in Manhattan Munch. So Munch is a gathering of kinky minded folks who get together to eat food and chat. It's not like a kink event. It's not like a scene event. Now, Munch culture has changed and it's become more of a like a discussion venue in many places these days, but originally it really was just you got to hang out and meet people who had similar interests. And we heard about the movie, and as a group, as a Munch group, we descended on a theater. And when I say we descended, we are like 20, 25 people in various fetishistic accoutrement and clothing and stuff. I remember I showed up with my thigh-high boots and my riding crop, and we went in there. And I don't know how this happened, but I like led the group in the theater. And I remember the guy was like, "Where are you all going?" And I held my riding crop. I said, "We're going to go see Exit D." And he goes, "Of course you are." And just opened the rope to us. And we went in and sat in like, 2 or 3 long rows and watched it together. And then afterwards went out and ate and talked about it. So it was like this big event. We made it into a big
Mm,
event. But the reason was the same as what you mentioned. This was like the first time that there was a mainstream movie that was supposedly going to talk about kink culture, or at
yeah,
least kink interests,
yeah,
which didn't, well, we didn't think was going to involve things like a murder or the drug trade or sex trafficking or all these other things that happened.
yep,
And so, we thought we should go and we should see what was going on in the movie.
yep.
And the conversation was very different that night. But before we get to the movie, let's talk a little bit about what you were talking about. Let's talk about the book versus the movie, because there are many changes. And then there are also, however, really interesting places where they kept things similar,
Mm,
which almost
okay.
led me to believe like maybe somewhere along the line, someone had written more of a straight
I
movie
think
version of
so.
the book, and then
Yeah,
they added in all this other stuff.
yeah. I think there was like somewhere, movies go through who knows how many rewrites and redrafts and stuff. So the basic premise of is that there is the in the book it's called the Club. In the movie it's Eden.
Yeah.
It's an island paradise of dominance and submission. People sign up to be submissives. In the movies, they're called citizens.
Oh god, that was
Uh,
one of the things that annoyed me the most.
um, I guess they didn't want to say slave. I don't know. Um, they the and to serve the guests. And one of them, Elliot, is a photographer who goes there basically to sort of deal with his psychological issues. He meets and falls for Mistress Lisa, who runs the club, or Eden. They have a few interactions together. Lisa basically finds herself falling for him too, and they leave, and she takes him away. They both go to New Orleans, um, and try to see if they can have a relationship there outside of this environment, the kink environment. And it's a romance. It has a happy ending. Now the biggest difference is that Eden has this whole the movie has this whole other subplot about diamond smuggling. And so Elliot is a
And
photographer.
murder.
Murder. He accidentally takes a picture of some diamond smuggler who's apparently never had his picture taken since he was a kid. He's willing, and so he and his henchwoman Nina, who's played by Iman, the model, um, they go off in search of him. Two detectives, played by Fred and Sheila, played by Dan Aykroyd and Rosie O'Donnell, they're also in pursuit of him. So four people are looking for this one guy on the island, and it takes them like several days to actually find him. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and there's a lot of like really sort of um I mean, like I said, it's Gary Marshall, so it's the humor is kind of sitcom-y. They bring in all this, they make like Fred's very, there's lots of gags about how uncomfortable Fred is with anything sexual. Um, how but there's also like gags about how big his dick is. He
Yeah.
he he has to serve as like one of the maintenance crew at the island. Rosie O'Donnell plays Sheila. She is also there. Um, she's making like lots of she provides a voiceover, which is another sign that something went reworked along the way. Um, without and Yeah, so there's a good 20 minutes of setting of this very contrived situation of setting up all the who photographed who, the diamond smuggling. There's a shootout in a strip club. Um, there's a lot of kind of tasteless jokes about. I feel like Rosie O'Donnell is kind of being humiliated because she doesn't look like a sexy woman is supposed to look like. Um, Stuff like that. And it's basically a MacGuffin story. It's almost, I felt like I was watching Laverne and Shirley and Lenny and Squiggy go to Folsom Street Fair, and because like Squeaky is, like Shirley is accidentally carrying a rich diamond or something in her purse, and
Yeah.
it's that
Yeah.
kind of, it just feels so contrived, and I so wish I mean, if I had all the time in the world, I'd probably, I'm tempted to like cut all that out and see
Hmm.
what's left over, because like the two plot lines barely intersect. It takes forever for them to actually take the obvious choice of like just requesting Elliot as a submissive, getting them together. But then Sheila and him are together. He doesn't say, "Hey, I'm a cop and there's a killer stalking you." No,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, it's
Yeah.
just
It's
ah,
yeah. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
no,
Yeah, the whole buddy cop thing doesn't make a lot of sense at all.
yeah,
Um, there are some things that are very similar to the book, like the whole island has this
yeah,
sort of strange, fantastic quality in terms of the clothes and the environment and the setting. And in the book, it talks about how much Lisa set that up, and they say that in the movie too. This all exists because of Lisa. You know, she's
yeah,
created it all. She's the top dog there and everything.
yeah.
She's
And
not,
they talk about,
however, she's not like the mistress of the island in the book, though. She's just like the head trainer. And so there's like
yeah,
the staff are like the people who like are the trainers. The masters and mistresses are the people who are paying to go to the island. And this
okay,
was a big difference between the movie and the book, is that the people on the island who are the submissives, they're also paying to go to the island. But
yeah,
in the book, they sell themselves for like a certain term of employment. And while they're
yeah,
there, they're supposed to be treated like real property. Like they're not supposed to
yeah,
leave the island, they can be punished, all this stuff. But I guess they thought that wouldn't fly.
yeah.
So
Well,
it's, you know,
this is they. I think that so obviously a lot, there's only so much you can get away with in an American movie and still get an R rating.
mhm,
And this, I think, was kind of straining against that a lot. So, for instance, in the book, there is a lot of male sexual interaction. There is practically nil. This is a very hetero, uh, for a libertine sex club. This is a very hetero place, except there's like lesbian flirtation, the usual lesbian flirtation. Like Lisa has Diana, who's this her girl Friday, who like, apparently wakes her up and rides horses bareback with her and all that. But um, yeah, so there's no, you get the distinct impression there's no, that it's all straight people or slightly by women, but that's it.
yeah,
Um,
in the book, in the movie, the character Martin owns the island.
yeah,
And Martin is a figure in the book.
yeah.
But what he is actually Elliot's boyfriend. And he knows
Okay,
about
yeah,
the club. He's part of the club, but he didn't make the club.
yeah.
And in the movie, there's no sense that they're anything but psychiatrist and patient. But once we get to the island, even in the book, once Elliot sees Lisa, he's not thinking about Dick anymore. He's not thinking about guys anymore. In fact, he becomes very upset if men show an interest in him. He
Yeah.
doesn't like those situations where he's put where he has to be with another man. He just seems to be obsessed with Lisa, and that always confused me in the book.
Mm,
Like, what? How? Okay, I get. Okay,
yeah,
maybe he's bisexual, but that doesn't mean you're only interested in one, and then you suddenly forget all that and you're interested in the other. That's not what
yeah.
bisexual, how that usually functions.
Mhm.
Um, I say as someone who is that I don't lose my interest in women just because I'm with men. You know, I don't. If I'm with a woman, I don't lose my
Yeah,
interest in men. Um, so there's that. You know, there are those differences, but there are some similarities. Several of the characters are named, even if their
yeah,
roles are slightly different in the movie. Um, and some of the backgrounds are similar. Like in the movie, we see that Lisa has a strained relationship with her father. That's gone into a lot more in the book, and a much more stereotypical abusive background
mm,
family situation. Whereas in the movie, we don't know that that's true. It's more like her father just seems cold and distant and doesn't really have space
yeah,
for her.
yeah,
And And then we're not really sure what's going on with Elliot in the movie. He seems to
Yeah,
have difficulty having
he,
relationships, but at the same time, he doesn't want to admit that he's kinky,
yeah,
and that doesn't
I,
really mesh.
yeah, he's of the two romantic leads, um, Paul Mercurio as Elliot in the movie, he's very flat. Like his whole character arc is that he wants to be spanked, he won't admit it. Lisa helps him overcome that. It's done. That's his whole character arc. I'm going to say that Dana Delaney is the only actor in this movie, or a significant actor, who walks out of this with their dignity intact. I think she was much more committed to this role. There's some much more, like we see her, for example, that scene with her father. We find out that her mother died recently. We go into her background where she had some abusive relation boyfriends in her as a teen. We talk a lot. So that's the glint of somewhere buried deep in all this is there's something good, but it's barely visible.
Mhm.
And I think that she was the only one who seemed to really take this seriously and like make her character believable.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So, of the
one
2
of
things, the book or the movie,
yeah,
what did you like about one versus the other, and what did you dislike about one versus the other?
to be honest, I haven't read the book in a long time, so
Okay.
I'm only going by what I remember. I do like that, the popular media, books and films about kink tend to overwhelmingly be male dom, female sub. So I'm glad to see a popular work that is uh, female dom, male sub, at least in part. And so I like that. I thought that was a good part of the book. I like the idea that the club in the book is pansexual, and there's all types there. I mean, I was a little, but if I remember in the book, there's like a men only section where Lisa is like the only woman allowed to go in there. Or am I misremembering that?
No, there is. Um, there's also some other questionable things,
Yeah. I
but
mean, like, you see, like, this is the kind of thing, like, I mean, I think every kinky person has their idea about what their dream fantasy island paradise would be like. And it's also the sort of thing that the more you think about it, the more difficult it makes, because they do address some issues, like everybody gets a full physical and all that, which I guess includes testing for STDs and so
that's
forth.
also in the movie.
Yeah. But there's also questions of when Lisa is dominating Elliot in the movie, she's is there like is it like blanket consent? They can do anything to you at the club, or is it more like, there's a is there like a blanket safe word everybody can use, I guess, that, and they don't really touch on that in the movie either. Like there's moments between Elliot and Lisa where I really wanted, where Elliot is saying no and Lisa keeps pushing, and I really wish they had included a like even a brief bit of saying, the collective safe word is, banana or whatever. um yeah, and that would have made that a little more comfortable with that. And there's a similar thing where, like, she's sleeping on the bed, he's sleeping on the floor, he wakes up and basically initiates sex with her, and it's
Mhm.
oh, and okay, now Sheila, Rosie O'Donnell's character, she meet her citizen, quote unquote, who was assigned to her in the movie. His name's Tommy. He's really aggressive with her, and I don't think your submissive sex uh, submissive should be that forward with her. I mean, I get the idea that he expected to be, sexually used, and Rosie O'Donnell is there on business, but like he's really pushing hard, and he should know better than that. So yeah, and even worse, maybe the biggest problem I have with the movie is that Omar and Nina, the smugglers who are,
Mhm.
they are the ones who like takes to this like a duck to water.
I would say she does. He is
Yeah,
clearly just not interested. He
yeah,
wants that camera. He wants that film.
yeah, yeah. He
He's
wants.
like, yeah, his citizen is constantly like trying to get him to do things like, do you want
Yeah,
to punish me? Right. And he's like, what? I don't have, it's like, I don't have time for this. Can I get somebody else? And it's just like, he's not interested at all. But yeah, you're right. Nina's just like, give me the fetish gear. Give me like 3 guys in a shower with me.
yep,
I'm going to town.
yeah. Oh yeah, she's walking around, with the, two men following her, holding up a parasol for her. She's having a time of her life.
Yeah. She
Um,
should stay there. Dump Omar. I mean,
uh,
honestly,
why does she work with this guy? He
I
treats her
know.
like crap. Um, yeah, so that was yeah, so that was now another thing is that bothered me is that now you talk about the Heartwood whips, and so we've got the trainers are wearing white, and they're often holding floggers. They never actually use them on anybody.
Or they like use them in the air every now and then.
Yeah, they're like
Like,
they might swing them around a bit.
yeah.
And I was just like, oh, so it's like, and it's not until like Lisa brings Elliot up to her private room for a private session, and she spanks him with like a hairbrush. And that's the first time we've seen any impact play, the first time we've seen any sort of like physical intensity. There's like people, we've got people in, almost nude. Um, like certainly no frontal male nudity. What do you expect from 90 from for an R rating? You get a handful of shots of female nudity, there's a lot of bare breasts.
Mhm.
Um, so there's a lot, and so what we see is all these people, we see people tied up, we see people following, doing around, but it's not until then we actually see anybody using any of these whips for anything.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if like, did they decide that, I think this was so cautious about what we can actually show middle America in terms of kink, that ends up becoming like, I guess, by our jaded standards, weak sauce. It's like, okay, so somebody will follow you around and call you master or mistress or whatever, um, okay, that's fun. And it's implied that there's a lot of sex going on, but there's
Mhm.
nothing, apparently there are all these whips and all these stuff is just for show. Never, nobody ever actually uses it. Like, remember that bit where the woman she was tied up, and a guy was tickling her with a feather,
Mhm.
and then the PA said, Citizen Ruby or whatever, report to the Sticky Bun Pavilion or something. And she just wriggles out of the bonds all by herself.
Mhm.
She didn't even have like somebody release her. She just said, oops, that's me, gotta go.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like,
So my feeling on this was this movie was very concerned with talking about defining these terms. What do these terms mean? BDSM and all the various acronyms you can make from that. It was very concerned about talking about consent. There's this scene in the fetish shop where Rosie O'Donnell, Dan Aykroyd's trying on some stuff that he shouldn't be trying on, and the woman is telling her like, well, you need like a slow word, a scene word, a stop word, like yellow. She's like,
mm,
oh yeah, yellow, because like this woman's making her really uncomfortable. And when they get to the island, it felt very much to me like the sort of scenario we create for introducing people to kink and to talking about sexuality, including there are like little classes and
yeah,
discussion sections where they're learning about things and discussing things. And I thought that's really nice because the movie presents the island. I mean, it's supposed to be this creation of this psychiatrist, right? And he tells Dan Aykroyd it's to help people investigate things about their sexuality without shame and guilt. Well, that is
mm,
not at all the case in the movie. The movie is all about money. If you got the money, honey, you can go and basically abuse anyone you want. because as for consent, that's like irrelevant in the book. Um, which I know a lot of people who like to read kink and stuff, or kink adjacent stuff and fantasy stuff, they actually don't want consent to be an issue. They
Mm.
like the fantasy of not being able to say no. They like the fantasy of
Yeah.
being forced to do things. And so that's more what the book plays into, but the movie is more about, I think, and I don't know why they would want to do this, but it felt very much to me like this is introduction to kink. This
Yeah.
is the introduction of what people can feel, and I never at any point when I watch this movie, even the first time and then this last time, I never feel like I as a kinky person am being made fun of.
Mm.
I feel more like the cops are being made fun of, that the
Mm.
criminals are being made fun of. And the
Yeah.
situations are funny, but even in the ridiculous, silly situations like, oh, the elevator doesn't work, or you got to go to the sticky buns thing. It's like, guess what? These people like that, and that's okay. They can
Okay.
like whatever they want, you know?
Yeah. I think you see, like I think it's trying to be positive, but it's also so cautious that
Hmm.
it's not going to give us anything that would be too scary.
Yeah.
So the physically harshest thing we see is Elliot being spanked by Lisa with a hairbrush. That's it. And I'm not trying to say that we all have our own levels of kink. We all have our own levels of what we're comfortable with.
Hmm.
Um, but we've seen I've seen people do stuff at parties that would probably scare a lot of people.
Hmm.
And I imagine you've seen similar things. And it's like, you see, this is why, like, I was amazed that this was adapted at all, because in the book, it's really dumping you straight into, like, this is like the heaviest, hardest core SM you've ever seen in your life.
Yeah.
And in the book, in the movie, it is so introductory. There's all these classes and seminars. Um, Most of the guests appear to be like middle-aged couples from Middle America. Um,
Yeah. I guess they're the
yeah,
ones who saved up enough money to
yeah,
go.
I guess. And like all these people are like, and like, the trainers are all in white. There's all the citizens are in these sort of, like, I don't know what, gold, I guess they're supposed to be colored or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
These weird, supposedly Lisa designs all the outfits, and I don't think fashion designers are strength, but it's all the guests wearing these different outfits, and it's, which I guess are supposed to, sort of gold colored things. And I guess it's supposed to be like nothing, like at one point it said this is not supposed to be reality. This is a whole
Yeah.
separate thing. Um, and I found it, and so that's like and there's so much therapy speak in it. There's so much, how do you, fixing marriages. It's very like, at the end of it, Fred, Dan Aykroyd's character, he he's estranged from his wife. He invites his wife over, who turns out to be this blonde knockout. And and Sheila notices that his bag is vibrating because he bought a vibrator.
Hmm.
No, the best vibrator in the world never saved a marriage.
Yeah.
I mean, I might be that there's something to explore here. There is something to say that if Fred is like really uptight about sex, and that's a problem with his wife and people in general, that's okay. There's something to explore there.
Yeah.
And I also much prefer the idea. Oh, by the way, all the citizens are like young, super fit.
Yeah.
Um, Almost all of them are white. Um,
Yeah.
I, you know, I think,
The only difference was like there are some people who wear glasses.
oh yeah, I think, isn't Reba the one they kept telling the top stop talking? Reba, the
There
one who
are
wore the
two
glasses.
twins who wear
Yeah.
glasses, and we always see them like banging drums or gongs or
Oh
something.
yeah.
So I don't know what they're doing, but
Yeah. The gong, like, yeah. So but yeah, there's one citizen who wore glasses all the time. I thought she was cute, but anyway. Um, yeah. So I think they wanted to remove any resemblance to, the usual black leather aesthetic
yeah,
that we associate with SM. I mean, we see Rosie O'Donnell in like a black leather dom outfit. And Iman as Nina, she's in this whole red number because she's like really getting into this. Um, but it's like, they seem to be, don't don't scare people who might come into this on a lark. And I
Yeah.
maybe and I from a strictly commercial point of view, that makes sense because we're not going to dump people into the middle of Folsom Street Fair and expect all of them to be able to handle it. And
Yeah.
we've got
See, let's talk about one of the big differences for me before we
okay.
move on. In the book, there are at least two rapes.
Mm,
Elliot is raped at one point, and then almost immediately afterwards, he takes his anger out and rapes Lisa. And of course, we mentioned they're the romantic couple. And of course,
yep.
these rapes lead to them falling in love. And we could say that that's a problem with Anne Rice in general, having that happen in some of her work. The movie doesn't have that. However, it does have that scene you mentioned where Elliot crawls up on the bed and Lisa's only kind of semi-awake.
Yep.
And he's like, let me do this for you. And she's like, you don't have to, but she seems to enjoy it after it gets going. In a situation like that, I think it would be up to the two people about what happened there, but it is borderline because she's clearly asleep when he starts.
Yeah, that
Um,
was
but for me as a rape survivor, I was very glad that they didn't have a positive portrayal of rape in the
yeah.
movie because I even wrote notes in this book when I first read it in 1994, and that did not please me then, and it didn't please me the second time around reading it
Yep.
at all. So that was an improvement, I thought, a big improvement in the movie. I feel like there are things that they could have improved or made more gentle without this ridiculous buddy cop thing. And I
Yeah.
still think you could have had a comedic element. Like, I'm totally fine with having Rosie O'Donnell in the movie as being this duck out of water who goes there for who knows what reason. And maybe we kind of see things through her silly ass view. I'd be fine with that.
Yeah.
Because she's not really judging. She's, starting to looks like to me at a couple points, she's starting to find it a little interesting.
Yeah.
And we can talk about,
Yeah, we can talk about
more of that.
her citizen Tommy.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move to our next discussion topic.
I mean, there's a lot I wanted to talk about, like how Lisa and Elliot's characters and how they differ in the book and the movie. Like, um, the very first scene in the movie is when a young Elliot has what I'm assuming is his first like has an early sexual experience. We see him as like as it's like 12 or 13 or something, with a woman in a maid's outfit, not a black and white maid's outfit, but with a French accent, and
Yeah.
her boobs are kind of out, and he knocks over something in the kitchen. She chases him around and grabs him and spanks him, pants down, underwear up. So it's like this is supposed to be his primal scene, his origin, whatever. Um, Now this is not in the book.
Mm-mm.
Like in the book, they go much it's much darker. Like if I remember correctly, he's like been a combat photographer. He's seen people die in front of him. It's much more about his coming to the club is much more almost about his like overcoming his fears of maybe of his fear of helplessness,
Hmm.
of being under control by somebody else, especially a woman.
Yeah.
And here it's just like in the movie, it's really, really simple. It's just he wants to be spanked. He's ashamed to admit it. That's the whole deal. And maybe a lot of what he's doing is trying to provoke Lisa into doing that to her. So he's a bit of a brat. Um,
Which he
but
is in the
one,
book too. I mean,
yeah, but it's like there's
very similar
never,
to the movie. He comes up, he's supposed to be shown off on a stage, and instead he like parades around and shows off his body and acts up, and they're like, nope, prideful slave, send him off, he's gonna get punished right away. And it's like, wow, like, okay.
yeah, that was odd too. Isn't that like, don't you want him to like play to the crowd? I don't know. Now
I mean, in the
the
book, he does it too, and he gets in trouble as well.
yeah.
So it's like,
So Lisa, they go much. Lisa has a much more complicated backstory in the movie. They talk about how she had bad experiences as a teen with boyfriends. She mentions like, she writes. So we get this whole detailed flashback where she's in college. She's writing about uh, Pride and Prejudice as with Elizabeth as a sub,
mhm.
and her professor in his office tells her to stop and take off her blouse and all that, and it's like, whoa. um Now I'm pretty sure that I again, like, I'm sorry, I haven't read the book in a long time. I don't think that anything like that was in the book, or am I wrong?
No, it's so the book, and this happens to a degree, but not as much degree in the movie. In the book, they also go to New Orleans at one point, and when as soon as they hit New Orleans, it's like their roles switch, and he becomes the dominant, she becomes more submissive, because the message of the book that I think anyone who knows me now will realize pissed me off is that when you fall in love, the woman is submissive and the man is dominant, and that's just the way
Mm,
that it should be. And that is not what happens in the movie at all. In fact, there's a big scene in a police, you know, uh, office, police precinct, where we see other women who are in abusive relationships, and Lisa's watching them, and she just can't handle it. She can't handle that, seeing women who have given up control, in her opinion, who have given up control, and they're not. They're there because they've got the film, and Elliot's giving them information about the criminals, and then that happens. But yeah, they spend more time. It was strange in the movie that you think, okay, this is going to be a movie from Elliot's viewpoint, and then we switch and we start getting more about Lisa. But that also happens in the book. In the book, it's every other chapter the viewpoint changes.
yeah,
So it's like they're trying to copy that, but then they add in this Rosie O'Donnell commentary every now and then. It was
yeah,
like, ah,
yeah. That, like, we're a good 20 plus minutes before we even meet Lisa in the movie.
yeah, yeah,
And I really
yeah,
think that she's more the protagonist than Elliot is.
yeah.
She, at least certainly more developed as a character and has a more interesting arc. Because like, going back to her flashback, um, she has the professor apparently doesn't do anything with her beyond just telling her to take her clothes off, which she does. She's telling this to like her like little coffee group of other women at the club. She's saying, I was a victim, and that's her explanation of why she did this. And then the so apparently they the professor just sort of passes her along to Dr. Halifax, the therapist who has
Mhm.
started the island. She goes to her, goes to his mansion, uh, you know, get undressed, wait, he dresses her up in like the full fetish outfit. And he basically says, do you want to be a sub? Do you want to be a dom? And she says, I want to be a dom so I can be in control of everything.
Yeah, he puts her in the submissive role, and then he starts saying like, I have to know what you want, otherwise I can't create a fantasy for you. And she's like, well, what if I want to be Dom? And he's like, and then they change her clothes,
Yeah.
as much as you change your clothes. That's a whole other topic
Yeah.
on how
He,
women
he
seeing
takes
clothes
her,
are.
he takes her cuffs off and she picks up a whip and flogs a pillar.
Yeah.
Not, but um, yeah, if I remember correctly, in the book, they talk about how she becomes the head trainer as like the ultimate act of, she becomes basically the ultimate service sub, in that she's taking on the burden of running the whole club and to make this fantastic world possible for other people. So
Yeah.
it's paradoxically her ultimate act of submission to be the headmistress or head trainer.
Yeah. Yeah. And the book is odd because it begins with her saying that she works at this club, she created the club in effect, and all this stuff, and now she's going to tell you this story. But then at the end, it's kind of confusing because what happens at the end of the book. And we'll get to that, like how the endings of the two things change.
Yeah.
But since we brought up Martin, here's this other question I had. So Martin, played by Hector Elizondo, who
Yeah.
is a well-known, he died recently, but he was a well-known actor. Um, he has a scene with the character Fred, played by Dan Aykroyd, where he explains to Fred that he created the island so that people can safely explore their sexuality and interests. So my question is, does what we see on the island live up to what he tells Fred he created it for? And I would say for the most part, yes. For the people who are
Mm,
actually there for the island, not our buddy cops, not our criminals, but the actual people going, that seems to be what they're doing. They're exploring their
mm,
sexuality and their interests.
yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, like I said, it's, we see it's all very hetero. We don't see any impact play or anything, any, needle piercing or anything else that's likely to scare anybody. We don't, so I guess, yeah, I guess in that regard, yeah, okay, it's a space where you can explore your fantasies, even like, we see a lot, people seem pretty happy there. People seem to be enjoying themselves. Uh, it's
yeah,
kind of sad that
I,
Nina, the criminal and murderer, is the one who seems to be most adapting to it. But yeah, even I almost feel like they could have done something with like Sheila, Rosie O'Donnell's character, actually being tempted to do something,
yeah,
and with, here's Tommy who will allegedly do anything she tells him to do.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I
but
I would have been fine if they'd introduced that mild comedic element in that one character
yeah,
and then just
yeah,
kind of explored. I mean, no, it wouldn't have been the book exactly, but maybe
yeah,
this was not the time and the space for the book because unlike the other movies we've talked about so far, I would say Exit to Eden is the most undeniably Hollywood of the
yeah,
films. It was released in mainstream theaters, at least across the United States, and it sounds like in Canada too. It had a sizable budget. They hired people who were well known at the time. Paul Mercurio had just come
yeah,
off of winning major awards for Strictly Ballroom. Dana Delaney had been winning, oh, I think by then she'd won at least 2 or 3 Emmys for her series China Beach.
yep,
Dan Aykroyd and Rosie O'Donnell were kind of at the peak of their careers at this time. And even Gary Marshall, as we've mentioned, was well known in American TV and had started making more movies and stuff. So
yeah.
they
And Pretty
didn't,
Woman was a big hit.
yeah, they didn't skimp when it came on spending the movie, but they don't
Yeah,
seem to have spent it on the things that really mattered, like a script and thinking about how you shouldn't shove these two different genres. I'd say
yeah,
like erotic fantasy and buddy cop together. Um,
yeah. I guess it's like, I mean, I think it's like they just ended up with, maybe they realized that if that they didn't have enough material to work with, and that would still have an R rating.
See, and
So they
I
had
think
to.
they could. I think if they'd
Mm,
stripped that buddy cop stuff out, they could have spent more time, especially if you'd had that Rosie O'Donnell character as like
yeah,
an aside to the main character of
yeah. I
Elliot
mean,
and
like,
Lisa.
yeah, from a commercial perspective, it makes sense to have an outsider who is sort of the wide-eyed, the audience surrogate who can ask questions and things. Um, yeah, it's like, even if I think that even if we did somehow strip out all the buddy cop, all that plot line, all that nonsense, we'd still have I think that you and I would still, that at least experienced kinksters would still find this kind of disappointing because, it's very, very training wheels.
Hmm.
And there's a place for training wheels. If it would please us with our jaded tastes, it would have scared everybody else out there, and it wouldn't have been commercially viable. And if it was commercial to be commercially viable, especially to people in 1994, it would have it could only go so far in the sexual realm.
Yeah. Well, let me share. So, my my slave, my consensual slave, who's been with me now, wow, it's going to be 23 years
Wow,
next month in just like
awesome.
3 weeks. Um, he's substantially younger than me. So he's 11 years younger than me. So I saw this movie when I was 26. He saw this movie when he was 15. And for him, um, he will tell you that he loves this movie
Okay.
because for him as a 15-year-old, this was very safe and very reassuring. Yes,
Yeah.
he does agree that the buddy cop stuff is ridiculous, but for him, he was like, wait a minute, guys can feel this way, and there are places where people can go like
Yeah.
this. And, now that turned out not to be the case. Sorry, everyone, if you're shocked. There are no mysterious islands that we know of where you can go and do this. But then again, we're not the big multi-millionaire billionaire set here. So who knows what
Yeah.
secrets
I,
there are.
I
But
I think you're right, is that it's it is rare to see the idea that this is a romance with a happy ending in which male masochism and female domination, male submission, female domination is definitely a part of the relationship. That's super rare,
yeah,
I think. And um, there's a book, and so I realized that it is great that that Fox, your slave, that him seeing something like that was probably like an oasis in the desert of like, so many mainstream depictions of male masochism, male submission are of them as basically freaks and losers and the guy who never gets the girl. And I
yeah.
think that, so yeah, so that in that regard, I think that's important. In fact, there's a book by Omni Khan called Vicarious Kinks, which talks a bit about mainstream depictions, and she suggests that part of the reason this movie was such a flop, among apart from the whole ridiculous buddy cop thing, is that people could not handle the idea that a submissive male could and a dominant female could win the girl. And Khan, in that book, she talks about how the other movies like Something Wild
Mhm,
and even Preaching to the Perverted, which we should probably do at some point,
mhm.
are both about men who fall for dominatrixes, but dominant women, but to resolve the romantic plot, they have to stop being submissive.
Yeah,
So it's like that they can't, the mainstream audience simply cannot accept that. It doesn't, it breaks the romance paradigm.
yeah. And it's different than the book. Because in the
Yeah.
book, they end up walking off, well, getting on a plane to fly off and get married and to leave the club behind. And they
Mm.
flat out say, we don't need this club anymore. We don't need this stuff anymore. Um, and it's like half the book is like that, like not at the club and rejecting it and finding true love. Whereas in the movie, and yeah, we're spoiling it for you all. We keep warning you about this. It's
Mm.
always going to be spoiled.
Yeah.
In the movie, Elliot goes back and wears a tuxedo and has himself chained up to propose to Lisa. And Lisa basically says, can we do bondage and babies together? And he's like, sure, we can do whatever we want. It's going to be our marriage. And he's like, and I feel great about telling people my wife's a dominatrix, like
Yeah,
she,
that's right, and that is a bold move, and I think it is good, and yeah, that is a bold move, and I think it's great to a message to tell people that yeah, you can. I mean, it's interesting to compare that to the ending of Secretary, which ends with a male dom female sub marriage, which and they taught and the ending is Maggie Gyllenhaal's character talking about how normal they look, but they have secretly do dom sub in I guess in the bedroom. But I guess I appreciate the idea that you know I think that's a positive message in that, yeah, you can have both. You don't have to make it. You can have bondage and babies. You can be a dominatrix and have a husband and a family and all that. And there's no who's to say you can't.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. So we'll get back to the partners question because I
yeah,
think that would be interesting. But let's go to our last question because we're kind of getting to that. Do you think this movie had any positive impacts on mainstream perception of kink or later media portrayals of kink? Um, I think it could have, but because it was so poorly put together and I mean, it didn't even make its money back in
yeah,
terms of what it cost. Because I was part of the Apple Munch. I went to Oil and Spiegel. I was part of the group at Columbia. We saw a teeny tiny little trickle of people who came in investigating things after this movie. But I remember after Secretary being a group, and suddenly there were like, oh, it's like 10% more people showing
yeah,
up. And then after 50 Shades, after the books, and then again after the movies, you're getting like 25% bump in the people showing up for munches and clubs. And now that
yeah,
they didn't stay, most of those people did not stick around. But there was like this bubble of interest, and there really wasn't after this. Or do you
yeah.
remember any sort of
Well, I
uptick
mean,
where you were?
Secretary was an art house hit.
Yeah.
50 Shades was just this gigantic thing. Um,
Very much
and I,
Hollywood like this was.
yes, and I think like but I also think is that it's, as I've commented before, 50 Shades, when you strip it out the kink, is really a very conventional, aspirational, commercially aspirational romance. And so that's much more palatable to mainstream tastes. As I've mentioned before, people have a hard time accepting male masochism and female dominance. Um, and it's a very, and so Secretary and um 50 Shades, like if you take out the kink, they're very conventional
Yeah.
heteronormative romances that people would had a much easier time accepting. I mean, maybe that you can make a case that, I've said that Secretary had to walk so 50 Shades could run, and you can make an argument there. Maybe, you know, X Eden had to be a flop before other movies could come along. I still think we get pretty blah representation in. I mean, the representation question is a whole different thing that we've
Yeah.
talked about before. But I think it's like yeah, I think I mean, it was significant. You know, maybe a guy like Gary Marshall was chosen precisely because he could take Pretty Woman is like about a street prostitute and this
Mhm.
super rich guy, and they made it into this fairy tale romance. Maybe that they figured that Gary Marshall could take, this other sort of slightly edgy topic and turn it into something that was palatable to the mainstream. And it wasn't. It was a mega flop, and it was a notorious joke. I hear Rosie O'Donnell on her talk show makes jokes about it off some of the time. Um,
Yeah, it, it I kept feeling like it had so much potential and
yeah,
they just made some really stupid choices that they didn't have to make. They could have made a different movie. I mean,
yeah,
this was the early to mid 90s. This is the age of erotic thrillers and
yeah,
erotic movies in general that were kind of soft,
mm,
soft on the edge of porn, but not quite porn. I mean,
yeah,
the heyday of that was the 70s, of course, porn showing up
yeah,
in mainstream theaters and stuff. But they could have done something with it, and for some reason they chose not to. And
yeah. They could have, yeah, but I mean, like they graft on this diamond smuggling plot thingamajig that, I mean, sort of makes it like a thriller, but again,
yeah,
it should have been. I mean, yeah, we could have, we could have, we could sit here and talk forever about how we could have fixed this movie.
yeah,
like making it more of a more psychological, making it a little darker, going with like Elliot having, talking about he's had some traumatic experiences in his life, and making it like, instead it's like this very sort of, you develop a crush on your maid when you're a kid, and that imprint, you sexually
Yeah.
imprint on that as an adult, and
Well, I will confess
like
the second time I watched this to prepare for this, I watched it through and took notes and kept stopping and rewinding to take my notes the first time. The second time, I just fast forwarded through a lot of that crap. I was just
yeah,
like, I can't stand you. I can't stand. Oh, here we are. Now we're talking about King stuff again. Now stupid plots. I just kept doing
yeah,
that.
yeah,
But yeah, I mean, I do recall people for about the year after it came out, and then you could tell when it came on to like cable
yeah,
and stuff again because then there was that little pop of interest, but it was very small. But I think what it did do is it like I know the book had a reprinting and things like that, so there was some interest there, and I think it's interesting that all the critics said the buddy cop thing didn't need to be there. So
mhm,
everyone knew what was wrong, which meant the critics might have been interested if they decided to do it more seriously. And I think it would
yeah.
have found an audience, even if it
I,
had to
I,
been an outhouse,
I,
an art
I,
house sort of thing.
you see, like, I think that this is a case of, there's a theory that we use humor to mask our discomfort with certain topics, and this is a case of like taking a subject that could, most people are uncomfortable with. I mean, both sexuality in general and kink in particular, and using too much humor to mask it. And as a result, it just feels like it's a farce and not anything that sort of serious, that like asks any sort of serious questions about. And that's, I mean, there's glints of that, as we've said before. The Dana Delaney, I think, is like, I think she thinks she's in a whole, Dana Delaney is in a whole different movie.
Yeah, yeah,
And I, it's interesting, like she was in a movie that came out a year after this called, I believe it was called Live Nude Girls, which is a bunch of women talking about their sexual fantasies. And there's a scene where we see this fantasy of her being spanked, her character being spanked by sort of mafia guys.
hmm
Um, I don't know if it's actually like, we see her bare butt. It's quite likely a body double. I don't know. Um, but it's like it was interesting to see her. This is her like her second movie to do, that was pretty sexually explicit and talked a lot about female sexuality. I don't know if it's better exactly, but it was, at least it was interesting. It showed her willingness to do uh some edgier stuff, and like she was
yeah,
co-starring with Kim Cattrall, who's always been willing to go and do sexual roles. um yeah, so yeah, it's like I said about when I was talking about Mercy, it's a failure but an interesting one.
yeah, yeah. So we talked about Dan Delaney. So the movie and the book create Lisa and Elliot. They're supposed to be the it couple. Did
Yeah,
you buy that they were the it couple? I
I
think
just
from the tone of
didn't.
my voice, you can tell what I think of that. But
I no, they just didn't generate chemistry.
I
They're
know, right?
they're Lisa's a much more is a much deep character. Elliot is just this like pretty boy who has this one little quirk. Um, they're, somebody who has like a hint of, if again, it's just miscasting. They just don't generate any heat. There's this like a centerpiece of this movie is a rollerblading race in which he's wants to win so he can get a like, Lisa's pulling away from him, so he wants to win it so he can get a private session with her, and
Yeah.
it's like, this is our centerpiece, a rollerblading race.
Yeah,
It was the
in the
90s.
book, they have, like, a sports day sort of thing,
Yeah,
and this is, like, let's strip out 99% of what's sexy about that, and this is what you're left with in the movie. Um,
Yeah.
but I
There's
didn't,
like
yeah, I
there's
did
a
not buy chemistry from them at all. And I will
yeah.
say all of that fell on Paul Mercurio. Now,
Mm.
I liked Strictly Ballroom. He was in another movie called 9.5 Weeks Again, where he
Oh, he
plays
was
like
the
an erotic character and also stars Malcolm McDowell. He was in a TBS like two-part Joseph thing, and I love all things Joseph. You can see my collection of Joseph from the Bible story
oh,
collection,
okay.
and he was okay in all those things, but I just didn't get
Yeah. Like,
why
well, that's a
Lisa.
book. Oh, like there's like like I said, in the book, he's supposed to have been a combat photographer. He seems, some horrible things. In the movie, I only think they're the only time that's mentioned is in a voiceover. And I think that they were like patching things up, like, using voiceovers like Sheila's voiceover to patch up, cover putty over cracks in the plot line.
Mhm.
And I think that this was a case of like they're trying to make him look like more than just a pretty face. And I just don't believe this guy has ever seen
No,
combat.
and he thinks an awful lot of himself, and I just was not buying it. I
Yeah.
didn't understand why Lisa would give up because she seems very invested in the movie, in being the one in control and the one in charge, but also the one who's really helping everybody. Like,
Yeah.
you
That that
know, she's,
that
I
ties
would call
into
her a
the
really strong service top, is what I would say more than
yeah.
anything.
Yeah,
And
she's the ultimate service top, but I also think that she's like this gets back into the dominatrix as therapist thing we
mhm,
talked about before.
exactly.
And it again, it's like, she's doing all these there's seminars and things. She's doing coffee meetings, consciousness raising sessions with the women guests. And it's just like, is this what we're doing here when we could be like having hot sex? Um, and yeah, so I felt like that this turns up so often as dominatrixes who act like therapists.
Yeah.
And again, it also gets into like, again, where the first one we talked about, um, Love and Leashes, that seems to be one of the few where the woman is a dominatrix in her private life because she enjoys it, is a dominant in her private life. Even here, Lisa is sort of doing this. Well, it's a little blurry because she talks about it as her job, but she also seems to feel it as a calling. But
Yeah.
again, it is like, it's not, is it something she does in her personal life? And maybe that's her character, is that she's let this become her entire life, and she can't really, she's like so used to living in this environment where she's the boss, and it's super, everything is under her control, that she hates being out of it. And she, like, in the bit in the police station where she sees these women talking about being abused by their partners, and it's just like, I hate this, I can't even hear about this, I want to
Yeah.
go back
Yeah.
to where I am sure nobody ever really hurts anybody.
Yeah, and Rosie O'Donnell's character, Sheila, calls her out on it. She's the one who convinces Elliot to go back. And
Yeah.
and she tells Lisa, there, I think the direct quote is, not all men are assholes, but we have to basically curate the ones that aren't.
Yeah.
Basically, if we don't encourage them, there's no reason for them not to be. But before we stop, I want to make sure we talk about
Yeah.
Sheila again, because you know who I wanted to see more of? Sheila and Tommy. Because
Yes.
we learn later that Tommy, she thinks he's an employee, but
Yeah.
he's not. He's a CEO at a company in the city where she lives, it turns out. And he says he goes there to the island a couple times a year because he enjoys this. It's like a
Yeah.
release valve. And that's sort of the stereotype of the CEO who plays at
Yeah,
being a
exactly.
submissive.
Yeah.
But there's a point in the islands where she's like stomping around her leather outfit, and one of the trainers, and this is really confusing in the movie, stops and says, "How can I fulfill your fantasy?" And she goes, "Go paint my house." Well, we see at the end when Tommy's waiting for her to get on the plane, and she's like, "Oh my God." And he's like, "You're a cop." And she's like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Looks, you're a CEO." Yeah. And they kiss. That was the most romantic and actual
Yeah.
believable passion in the entire
Well,
movie was their kiss.
is it like, but I mean, is it like Sheila she's only now attracted to him because he looks like, a guy in charge, that he's wearing a suit and he's
I
talking about my company, is like,
I
if is
don't
now that he's rich and she's sure.
I don't know. I think it was because before she thought he worked there, and she kept trying to find Elliot and trying to do stuff to fit in. I mean, she did use his services. Like we see him bring her food, we see him give her a massage and things like that. She just isn't interested in the more interpersonal stuff. And then she realizes, like, wait, he's a person. He's leaving the island. He's not like an employee. And I wonder if it's because she thought it was all a show, like he was being paid to behave this way. And now maybe she's like, wait, it's not a show, it's a thing he's actually interested in. And then the final voiceover, they've gone out on dates. And I also love this line. She's like, after my second date with CEO Tommy, he fulfilled my fantasy and sent over 4 men who painted my house. And I love
Yeah.
that because I know as a woman who's dominant, a lot of times you get mixed messages. If you're born and you appear to be female and you're raised to be a woman, ultimately you have these constant messages in your life that if there is anything, I mean anything, that should get done, you better get that stuff done before you do anything to take care of yourself. And it's like one of the biggest challenges for women to have sexual satisfaction is if anything else is on their mind and they've been conditioned to have everything else on their mind,
Mm,
they can't relax enough to get into just vanilla sex, let alone kinky sex. And
yeah.
I thought, like, that coupled with the Elliot and Lisa possibly staying kinky but being a couple, those seemed like two positive threats. You also brought up Fred and his ex-wife maybe trying to sort things out. So there's kind of that happy ending.
Yeah.
But the only people I believe to have any chemistry was eventually Tommy and Sheila. And again, we
Yeah.
don't know because we don't see what really happens, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, Sheila's whole thing seems to be she uses humor as a defense. And
Yeah.
I mean, and a lot of this is basically just Rosie O'Donnell making kind of mediocre jokes, but her whole thing seems to be she uses humor as a defense. And maybe she could sort of, I would have liked to see an evolution in that way. That would have been an interesting to see, like, her forming some kind of connection with Tommy. And maybe she does get in a moment where she can, get into a dominant mode that Tommy would enjoy. I guess I'm
Well,
just troubled by the idea that only when it's proved that he's wealthy and in charge in his regular life, does she find him, masculine. I don't know, masculine enough. That bothered
yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's an interesting. We've only got 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting artifact in kink history.
Yeah. Do you think this is a question I just recently thought of? Do you think if they remade this movie now, has enough changed in mainstream culture and in Hollywood that they would make it more an erotic movie and just not have that comedic element?
Well, the problem is that a lot of movies these days are like, there's less sex and nudity than there was in the 90s. A lot of that's because of, like, shifting changes in the industry. Movies have to be sold overseas now, often where there are much even stricter laws about nudity and sex. So it would be a hard sell. I mean, if you had the right director, you had a studio that was willing to go on the edge, that was willing to push the envelope on the MPAA, that was willing to not shy away from, like, the gay and lesbian stuff, that was willing to show some, you know, not quite so fluffy
Mhm.
BDSM. I'll give a definite maybe. I mean, like, sure, I'd love to see that, but I think I kind of think we're a long way away from that. Maybe someday.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could I think you can make a sexy movie without necessarily showing actual sex or
Mm,
showing
yeah,
a lot of nudity. So I think there is that line you can walk, and there's a lot you
yeah,
can do with camera angles. I mean, we saw that in Love and Leashes. There's a lot of camera angle work there, but it I found it at least to be a very
yeah.
sexy movie.
That's a good point. Is that there's in Love and Leashes there was very little nudity. There was a lot of sex, sensual moments. I don't think you ever saw the female lead nude or even
Mhm.
topless.
Yeah.
Um, Here it's like you do get to see a fair amount of female toplessness. You get some frontal female nudity. You don't see any dick. Sorry if that's what you're hoping
You
for.
do on the video. You do on the video.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay, the
On the
version I saw did
DVD,
not have.
they're, like, in passing, it's not close up, but there are
Okay. Oh,
some.
you get a
Yeah, yeah,
0.3 second
yeah,
glimpse of the angle of the dangle.
yeah.
Oh
Well,
boy,
thank you so much, Peter, for talking with me about
this
this.
is a pleasure always.
Alright, and
And
we'll talk later about
okay,
something
and you
else.
have a good night too,
Alright,
and my best to your household.
alright. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.